E mihi ana ki te rangi, e mihi ana ki te whenua, e mihi ana ki ngā tupuna i te pō, e mihi ana ki ngā uri i te Aotea tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ore tiwi kua haere mai nei ki te titiro i tēnei hui, ko Jack Tame aho. It is a pleasure to be with you for this VIP session, this VIP dialogue, where we consider the future of energy and what it means for business in the APEC world. To discuss the important topic today, we have two experts in this field. Valerie Speth, who is the Managing Director of the Renewable Power Group Asia Pacific, and BlackRock, a qualified mechanical engineer. Valerie has more than 15 years experience in renewable energy businesses in Europe and APAC in the areas of strategy, M&A and operations. Before relocating to APAC, she led corporate strategy and M&A at Dewey in Germany and worked at E.ON and Accenture, specialising in the energy sector. It's great to have you with us, Valerie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very honored to be here today.
I'm looking forward to sharing in some of your insights. Joining Valerie is Mike Fuge, who is the CEO of Contact Energy in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Previously the Chief Executive of Refining New Zealand, Mike has a long history in the energy sector, both in Aotearoa, New Zealand and internationally. He has previously been the Chief Executive of global renewable energy owner, operator and developer Pacific Hydro in Australia and held senior roles at Genesis Energy and Royal Dutch Shell Group. Kia ora, Mike.
Kia ora, Jack. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. And thank you so much for your time and expertise. The way this will work is that we'll try and facilitate what is hopefully a relatively natural and organic conversation. Of course, for everyone who is watching us from online, regardless of where you are within the APEC economies today, we ask that if you have any pertinent questions, any burning questions, although that's probably a word we want to avoid over the next half hour, submit them through your Microsoft Teams chat function and we'll try to get to those. Perhaps the best place to start, given this APEC 2021 Leaders Summit coincides with COP26, is with the big picture, with the macro perspective. And Valerie, I'll start with you. Where do you assess we are in terms of the transition from fossil fuel-based economies to cleaner energy solutions?
Sure, yeah, I think one thing we have seen is that at the moment at our client base, there's no other topic ranking higher than climate change. So climate change is the historic investment opportunity and it will be there for the next decades. And what we see is that developed and developing countries are following this different decarbonization path. And it really depends where at their current stage of economic development. So the more mature ones are greening the existing power portfolio. The ones that are developing, emerging, they need additional or they have additional demand from electrification, population growth, also consumer growth. And that's the reason why you see that in the last years, the emerging countries and only the last 10 years, the energy power production increased by almost 80%. But still, we have 44% of all this production being coal. So that is a very big difference if you compare that to developed countries, because in developed countries, there have been financing solutions in the past, and these financing solutions allowed to increase the renewable shares in these countries. So, I mean, all of us know that Paris Agreement has not been done yesterday. So, but something happened 2020. And for me, you know, coming from more operational background, now being in the finance industry, it almost feels like in 2020, this wave has hit the financial industry. And not the financial industry, also 123 countries have committed to net zero. And that's a very good first step, because it seems that somehow that gap between different opinions, if climate change really exists, is closing. And you could almost feel like there's a global consensus. So in addition to this, not only politically, but also then from investor base, this topic is more and more increasing, and we're having a lot of conversation. So we have seen, especially in the last year or two, a lot more capital flowing in this markets.
Mike, what do you think? Where do you assess we are in terms of the revolution in clean energy?
And Jack, that's a very appropriate term, that term revolution, because these things are never linear. And in terms of where we are today, I think there's been a lot of hard work up to this point. We're now at a point of inflection where you will see things over the next 5 to 10 years change very dramatically in terms of economies decarbonising. It really feels as if we have turned the corner, as Valerie said. And what's encouraging, it's no longer technical innovation, but as Valerie referred to, that commercial and financial innovation that people are bringing to bear. So it's fair to say the very best brains in the world are turning their minds to this now. And when you get that, I think you will see an exponential rate of improvement in our decarbonisation agendas across the region.
The speed of change is always the concern, though, right? Like you have both noted, I think most developed economies and thinking people accept that climate change presents a very real, if not existential, threat to us all and to the planet. But it's the speed of change and the speed of adaptation that is always the concern. And for all the promises that were made in Paris, if you go through countries' individual contributions and compare them to what was promised, there are plenty of reasons for pessimism when it comes to governance in this space. What do you think, Valerie, are the biggest barriers to ensuring that this revolution comes with the speed that is necessary to match the crisis?
Yeah, so I guess it's very important to think in different elements. So the first element, I think, that needs to be considered is for sure the regulatory framework. So we have seen in the past countries, and I mean, there's a lot of experience, especially in Europe, that if you implement a regulatory framework and all of a sudden you change your mind, you will find stranded assets. And that means it creates for investors a high risk. And this high risk will be priced in, which will make it more expensive. So there are interesting examples. For example, if you take India, it's very competitive, but it has a stable framework. So investors know what they're getting into. And that means you can plan and you can minimize the cost of risks because you know what you should be expecting. And I think that's one very important element to it. The second one comes a little bit more from the people side. So I think no one can do this alone, not a government, not a public company, not a private company, not a society itself. So I think all four need to work together. And we need to bring the people on board. We need to educate. We need to help people upskill, you know, because there's also the social element of it. And I mean, this all also have been there like 10 or 15 years ago where people said, like, what with my job? Yeah, but it's also going to create a lot more other jobs. It just might require different skills or maybe even the same ones. You know, if you compare, for example, offshore wind to the oil and gas sector, it's pretty similar in terms of how good processes you need to build such an offshore wind farm. And then the third one is we need to find more creative financing solutions. So the products that we had in the past will probably not fit the future. So we need to be creative. And one thing is, for example, you match catalytic, where some investors take a little bit a higher risk. And then you match this with institutional money. So you're able to create a bigger pool because the essential thing is scale. So without scale, you know, we're not going to get there to a very high penetration of renewable energy.
Mike, what do you think? What are the biggest barriers?
Well, look, number one is I'm an optimist in human capabilities and nature. And so the big thing, if you look at, say, in the wind industry, governments had to give it a bit of a nudge at the beginning, but the innovation and the rapidity with which those costs have come down over the last decade has been mind-blowing just by people innovating, being creative, finding new technologies and making that one technology all that better. We always talk about the energy trilemma, and we talk about decarbonisation, we talk about affordability of energy, and we talk about reliability of supply. And if we want that decarbonisation to succeed, it's really important we get those other two elements right so that people continue to have confidence. And Valerie already talked about the importance of that investor confidence. And if you undermine the confidence of people, if there are doubts about security of supply, if you impede the affordability of energy, then people can say, hey, we're losing confidence in that decarbonisation agenda. So it's really important we manage that trilemma, as we call it, and that enables us to have both people behind us, but also investors behind us, which is really key.
Valerie, you talked about the ways that we can structure capital to try and promote the acceleration of this change at scale, but can you talk to us a little bit more about what role businesses can play in accelerating the change?
Yes, sure. I think also then the last 1 or 2 years, a lot of process has happened. And I think at this point of time, companies really rethink their strategy because it's also requested by investors. So not only in terms of what kind of carbon emission do I emit, but what is happening throughout the entire value chain. And one problem, or not problem, but a challenge is, how are you going to measure this? You know, what's your benchmark and what do you compare it to? So everybody knows we need to reduce emissions. And I think it's wonderful, you know, to have a framework globally and everybody might stick to the same. But maybe it's not what we need right now. At the moment, we need speed. And I think it's very important to identify where are the main triggers. What are the main elements we want to change to decrease, let's say, at least the first 60–70%, because that's in general low-hanging fruit, and then it gets really difficult. So I think companies have invested a lot into analysis, into really understanding like what is happening throughout their value chain, and also in discussions, you know, with governments. And you see it in the society. People move towards eating less meat. People have understood during the pandemic that travel is maybe not necessary as expensive as it has been before. So I think there's also an opportunity in terms of educating and making each of us, you know, think about what we want to do and what's the increased temperature we are able to stabilize it. Is it 2, 3, 4? And what will be the impact? You know, will your house still be there, or would you have to sell it? Or what is the overall impact of having temperature increase?
Mike, we heard in the keynote speech from the chair of Tesla, Robin Denholm, she talked about the future of energy being international. I wonder what that means to you and what that means to Contact.
So look, for me, that means it's very simple. This is not a national problem. It is a global problem. CO2 does not respect borders. And so we have to take an international approach to the reduction of CO2 emissions across the globe. And so if countries like New Zealand can do more because we have an incredibly underdeveloped renewable resource here, both in terms of wind and solar, and if we are able to export that to nations which have less opportunity, we should take that opportunity because the globe, it is a global effort that we need to be focused on here. And that's, look, for Contact Energy, that's very much why we invested in the green hydrogen study with Meridian. We were interested in how we could help on a global platform, help the decarbonisation agenda and hopefully accelerate the development of renewable energy resources here, to Valerie's point, faster. The nice thing about companies is they do have a bias to action as to writing reports. And we at Contact have that bias to action. We have a development pipeline of fantastic renewable energy projects. We want to get after them. And the New Zealand economy by itself will not stimulate all those projects. So we're looking international all the time.
Well, Mike, you said you're an optimist, so I'm going to put you on the spot here. The next time New Zealand hosts APEC in 21 years, what will Contact look like? What will New Zealand's energy sector look like?
Oh, look, Contact by that stage will be well and truly 100% renewable energy. We'll be a much bigger company because we'll have had the opportunity to build out the fantastic geothermal and wind resource we have in our development pipeline. We'll have engaged the New Zealand customers in decarbonising their own homes. And they will have gone with us on that journey. So it will be a very different company, but it will also look in many ways the same, because one of the wonderful things about renewable energy, it is intergenerational. And so if we as businesses can adopt that view of, exactly as you say, one generation on, what are we going to look like? That's a really big shift. And so that's a nice question, Jack. I look forward to 21 years' time looking on at Contact and the great things they have achieved.
Valerie, I've got a couple of questions for you on the finance side of things. First of all, how should governments work alongside investors?
Yeah, I think it's very important, to have an open dialogue. As I said before, no one can do this alone. So I think the government, a stable regulatory framework really allows investors to bring in money. And that at the moment, money is not a problem. There's a lot of money out there, and all of it is shifting towards investment that have an impact and are related to decarbonization. So I think being very open about what would investors need to bring more in capital and what kind of risk could be reduced by implementing strong schemes to reduce the additional premium.
Okay, how can we make renewable energy sources more attractive for investors? You said there's plenty of money washing around out there.
Yeah. So this goes maybe back to implementation. So you need to have a project, and I think that's at the moment where we have some shortage, because renewable energy is pretty local. So you need to develop on a local basis because you need land, you need all the permits. So you need to put a little bit money into this to come to that stage, And then at one point, you need someone who's gonna buy this electricity. And this is where the government can help to put a framework in place that, this either government or utility or end consumer is buying to have a contracted revenue. So I think the renewable energy sector is already very attractive. And if you look at returns in Europe, it's very stable. If you think 50 years back, it was so expensive, and now it's so cheap. So it can compete. The technology is proven over decades. But the thing that adds risk is just how will it look like for the next 20 years, and how does the revenue stream look like? And if you look at coal plants or other big investments, and infrastructure is always a big investment, you cannot just rely on a merchant where you don't exactly know what will change because of other regulatory frameworks. So I think the trigger to develop more on-scale projects, also locally for developers, is to allow all of them, from developer to investor, to know who's going to purchase this electricity.
Mike, you mentioned before Contact's investment in the green hydrogen study. Can you talk to us a bit more about the potential for green hydrogen? I know there is a lot of buzz, but from your perspective and Contact's perspective, what makes it such an exciting opportunity for the future?
Oh, look, the exciting thing about green hydrogen is it allows renewable energy to be exported around the world. It's not the most efficient process in the world, but what it does enable is for countries with an abundance of renewable energy to convert it to green hydrogen or to ammonia, and for it to be exported to economies which don't have that abundance of renewable energy. And in a globally in a well-connected world, that means we can all go on this decarbonisation journey together. It also offers the opportunity to replace carbon-based petrochemical feedstocks with very green chemical feedstocks based on hydrogen. And whether you're talking about fertilizers or steelmaking, hydrogen provides a key to sustaining those industries and decarbonising them very rapidly at the same time. So it does look very exciting.
Yeah, can you talk to us just a little bit more about Contact's research there? Because beyond decarbonisation, there are myriad options when it comes to using hydrogen as an energy source and myriad applications.
Yes, there are. And so we ran the study with Meridian. We had over 80 respondents that we put out expressions of interest. We've got a short list. And the interesting thing about the responses is that they weren't just focused on export, they were also focused on the domestic uses here in New Zealand. So there is potential uses. It looks very viable as a conversion of heavy transport. So if you think of the buses going to our very sensitive eco tourism areas like Milford Sound, those buses running on green hydrogen. It offers opportunity in the conversion of urea from carbon-based hydrogen production to green hydrogen production. it offers the opportunity for export as ammonia and conversion back to hydrogen and being burnt for power stations. So there's a full range of opportunities that have emerged from the study, which we're very excited about.
And why is New Zealand so well placed?
Well, number one is we have an abundance of renewable energy at a very good cost, low cost. And the second thing about the renewable energy, it is backed by an excellent hydro systems, which now allows that less reliable solar and wind to be backed and firmed up by hydrogen. We also have, both in Southland and Northland, significant deep water ports, which are well used to exports. And quite frankly, as a nation, probably more than any nation in the world, we are a nation of exporters. We understand overseas markets. We know how to export. We know how to engage. And we base our relationships with people on the very long term. So I think New Zealand is well positioned in that regard.
I'd invest in you. Don't know about Valerie. We'll see. We'll work on it. We'll work on it. Valerie, the APEC region accounts for about 60% of world energy demand at the moment. You've both talked about the need for greater certainty around legislative requirements, and you talked about the greater need for certainty about a production line of significant infrastructure works to support this revolution. Are APEC governments doing enough at the moment, and is there more that they could be doing, or more things they could be doing together to help promote this change?
Yeah, so I think what we focused in that first wave of the energy transition was really the generation part. And this was wind and solar at large scale to bring down the cost. So the higher the penetration you find in an energy system, the higher the intermittence. And depending on each country, this intermittence creates something in a system. So in some systems, they're able to manage this for a long time because they might be connected to other countries. But then if you have kind of like an island, you know, the penetration doesn't even need to be that high, but to have a need already for balancing. And that means you need technologies that are able to produce in the times where, for example, you don't have wind and solar, or that are able to give it back to the system at another time and match demand and generation. And to fully carbonize this, as you said, we need a different infrastructure. So, and we need to have this from a technology point of view in different scales, something that's very quick and able to react, such as gas, you know, but then something where you can store and maybe take out a little bit later onwards. So depending on the application, there's a good set of technologies from battery to hydrogen, you know, a lot of different options that might allow to balance the system. And the infrastructure is needed because if you look at all the countries, the investments have been done 30, 40 years ago. And because there have been very high investments in the past, there's only been a couple of upgrades. But now if you change the entire dynamic from a physical perspective, you need to adjust your investment as well. And I think there are already some initiatives, especially in the areas where you have a high penetration. So if you look at Vietnam, for example, there's a really strong regulatory framework for wind and solar. What happened is so much demand, you know, gigawatts in only 1 year. And that's a showcase what you can actually politically do in a very fast speed if you have the right regulation. But the next challenge is to build up the system that will deal with it. And with this, they decided to allow also the private sector to come in and not only the government sector to invest into infrastructure.
Mike, what do you think? Should APEC governments be doing more or be working together more in this space?
Oh, absolutely. And there's different levels of support. So first and foremost, and the easiest, is making sure that the conversation, the korero, continues, enabling connections like this between countries so we get the conversations going. But I think where governments need to be working, particularly in the APEC region, is making sure that we do work towards a level playing field so that the regulatory settings are as common as possible, that no one's giving carbon-based products an easy pass into their economy, that there is appropriate carbon taxes and very evenly applied carbon taxes across the region so that these new technologies, these renewable technologies, can compete and compete fairly. And I think if governments turn that mind to that, to number one, enabling the conversations, number two, enabling common regulatory, but also making sure that our markets are playing with a level playing field so that carbon-based products are appropriately penalised, I think that would be a great start.
Okay. Valerie, we're seeing strong consumer interest in supply chains and supply chain problems at the moment and production methodologies. Do you see the same consumer interest in terms of energy sources that different businesses are using for the production of goods?
Yes, I think I can totally agree to that statement. Yeah. Now, not only like at the first scale, but all different phases throughout the supply chain, we can see that phenomenon.
And you see that for the production of goods as well, that consumers are similarly interested in the production methodologies and the energy sources that are required?
So I think there's still a difference between emerging markets and their developed markets because the education level is different. So I see this trend, and this trend has been there also for many years in Europe. So in Europe, there are already different certification systems that allow you to understand like what's the supply chain on this product, where has it been produced and where the elements of producing not only maybe from an environmental perspective, but also from a social perspective in an impactful way. And I think for emerging countries, we're still 10, 15 years later, and that means the developed countries need to help cut that decade, and help the developing countries to maybe save a couple of years in that transition by supporting in terms of education.
Mike, do you see something similar? If you look in that crystal ball of yours, do you see the values proposition for consumers changing?
I think absolutely you can see that happening today, that consumers are becoming a lot more curious about where their products are coming from and whether those products are services like electricity or whether the physical products they have in their home. They're curious, they're more and more curious about where they've come from, the ethics that have been involved in their production. So we talk about ESG, environmental, social governance. That is becoming an increasingly important element to a much wider range of consumers. And so as companies, we look forward to that future where it is absolutely a consideration for all consumers.
All right, we only have a couple of minutes left, so I might get some closing thoughts from both of you with this key question. A key focus of the CEO Summit this year has been sustainability and how we can promote an inclusive recovery. What would be your advice to businesses looking to do better in this space? And Valerie, we'll begin with you.
Sure. So from my perspective, I think it's very important to have a dialogue between all of us, understand what's happening, and then conclude, how do we want this world to look like in the next 10 years? And I think even though we talk a lot about risk and what might be difficult, I think it's the opportunity of our decade. And as we've heard in the last days, also in COP26, the next unicorns will be in that sector. So everybody has an opportunity and a chance to think about what will be their unicorn.
And Mike, what's your advice?
My big thing for business, I've got young children. Valerie has young children. My big thing for business is to re-engage with the next generation, the young people. I came into energy because I was absolutely fascinated by it. It would be great to re-engage. You talked about that longer term vision, to re-engage the young people in the technical challenges, as Valerie said, finding that next unicorn. So if we can re-engage the next generation, the young people, to come into the industry, bring their creativity, bring their energy to the industry, that would be a great outcome.
Fantastic. Well, we're out of time. Thank you both so much for your time and insights. That is Mike Fuge and Dr. Valerie Speth. Thank you for submitting your questions and points throughout this conversation. We'll make sure it's available online so you can share it with your colleagues.